The Dirt with me, Mike Howell, an eKonomics podcast where I present the down and dirty agronomic science to help grow crops and bottom lines. Inspired by eKonomics.com, farming's go-to informational resource, I'm here to break down the latest crop nutrition research, news, and issues, helping farmers make better business decisions through actionable insights. Let's dig in. Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome back to The Dirt. We have an exciting episode in store for you today. I've got my good friend Bobby Golden on the recording with us today. Bobby, welcome to The Dirt.
Glad to be here with you, Mike. It's been a while. Good to catch up again.
It has been a while. We've been working forever, it seems like, trying to get this episode nailed down and get it recorded. And between your schedule and my schedule, it's just been tough getting together. Bobby, before we get started, if you will, kind of introduce yourself to our listeners. Let them know what you do and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so for those of y'all out here that don't know me, my current profession, I'm employed with Simplot Grower Solutions as the Director of Agronomy for the Sales Enablement Team. And what that entails is I have about 12 regional agronomists out there embedded in each one of our business units that are out to give the best agronomic advice to our crop advisors on a daily basis.
And when I first met Bobby, Bobby was the soil fertility specialist and rice specialist with Mississippi State, and we did a lot of work together, but that's been several years ago, Bobby. A lot of water under the bridge since then.
Yeah, and there's water under the bridge right now. If you go to Greenville, Mississippi, I still get to reside down home, and the river's high and water's rolling, but it's been about 10 years at Mississippi State, made a lot of good friends, and Mike, you're one of them.
Bobby, that water's high. I don't know how much rain y'all got up in Greenville the last couple of weeks, but I've had in excess of about 15 inches on the south end of the state. It's making it awful tough to do anything in the field.
We weren't that high, but we had at least 4 to 5 where you're standing in spots.
So, Bobby, let's go ahead and get this thing kicked off. When I first started working in row crops, and that's longer ago than I care to mention today, I know you've been doing it almost that long, but I thought cotton was the only crop we could grow in the state of Mississippi. We had fields that had been in cotton production for over 100 years, and some things happened, and we started making some changes. So talk a little bit about the history of row crop production in the Mid-South and how we changed our production systems a little bit.
Yeah, if you really get to looking at the history of row crop production in the mid-southern United States, we're predominant a cotton and rice culture for numerous years. And then in 1998, when the advent of Roundup Ready crops started coming out, as well as we made a major shift in the way we looked at soybeans with Lanny Ashlock and Larry Heatherly implementing the early soybean production system. So what that did is turn a crop that we used to think of as poverty peas into something that brings ROI to the farm gate. So somewhere at around that 1998 to 2000, when we really started getting away from cotton production, or thinking about getting away from cotton production into more of a grain-based system. Now, that change didn't really occur till 2007, and that's when we saw the sharp decline in cotton acreage and soybeans become the next king, especially in the Mid-South.
Yeah, there was also a critter in there that was attacking our cotton crops at the time. The cotton bollworm became resistant to most of our insecticides, and that kind of made a lot of people want to get away from cotton production as well.
You know, and if you also look at it when we talk about cotton and rice production, those are two very, very intense labor-driven crops from start to finish, right? Much more so, in my opinion, than a corn and soybean crop.
No doubt about that. A lot of people wanted to grow corn. They thought all they had to do was go out and irrigate it once every week or two and didn't have to worry about it. I think they learned a valuable lesson that first year or two, but it's definitely not as labor intensive as cotton or rice. Bobby, when we made this shift, everybody thinks that if you have crops in a rotation, that's going to improve your soil and improve your soil health. And that's true to a large extent. But a lot of these fields have been growing cotton for years and years, and you started introducing new crops in. What happened to our soil fertility levels after we made this change?
What we see across the United States right now is a decline in soil test potassium, a lot in our southeastern soils. And I think one of the things that led to that in the Mid-South was when you look at nutrient removal rates cotton monoculture versus a corn and soybean rotation, what you're really seeing is monoculture cotton removes about half the amount of potassium out of the soil as does corn and soybean. So about 2x removal rate of potassium in the grain as compared to when we remove cotton, seed, and lint.
You know, Bobby, we had Lyle Cowell, my counterpart that covers the Canadian region, on 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he was talking about the same thing. They made some crop rotation shifts in that part of the world, and that was one thing he was cautioning. They're seeing the same decrease in potassium levels that we're seeing across the Mid-South.
Well, you look at that, Mike, and when you had that change in 2007 and we were learning to be grain-based farmers, then you had a rise in potash price, and those acres that we were fertilizing, we maybe backed off on, and we started in a hole, and we've been playing catch up ever since.
Bobby, you mentioned the high price of potassium fertilizer, and that's something that's raised its head again here in the last 3 or 4 years. We've had record high prices, and we have seen a lot of growers that backed off of that. Now, if you had that soil test inventory built up and had your K levels where they needed to be, you could get away with that for a year or two. Are you seeing the same thing, people that backed off, and what are those levels looking like after they backed off for a year or two?
You know, what we routinely see is if you've been following a sound fertilization program based on build and maintain, that in those really tough years, like we experienced a couple years ago or in 2008, you can back off a year. But that doesn't mean you need to eliminate potassium fertilization. So you're going to have to come back to it. And if you look at soil test summary, I think the last soil test summary that was put out was in 2020. We've got a new one coming out. But the majority of soils are testing below soil test critical values in the eastern United States, and most of the states in the southeastern United States test below critical levels, which suggests that we don't need to take a year off. But that's averages, right? That's not specific farms.
You know, Bobby, we had Antonio Malorino on last year, and we talked a good bit about that. Actually had 2 episodes dedicated to that. But why do you think these soil test inventory levels keep declining?
Well, I think as we've improved genetics, as we've improved fertilization practices, we've grown more crops. And when we grow more yield, we remove more fertilizer. For instance, if you look at what we're removing in soybeans, and depending on whose data you look at, can range from 1.3 to 1.8 pounds of K2O per bushel removed. When you see these 80 to 90 to 100 bushel yields that we're pulling out with soybeans routinely, maybe not farm averages, but routinely, we can get ourselves in a hole really quick because, in all honesty, and coming out of the previous academic world, there's not a lot of dollars out there for soil test work, right? If it's not coming from people like you and I and some great commodity board support. When I was at Mississippi State University, all the commodity boards supported us very well in that, as well as when I was at the other research institutions that I worked at. But we've got to keep up pace with genetics on our crop removals. And that means putting the work on the ground, doing the work, and figuring out what those removal rates are.
So, Bobby, we've talked a little bit about soybeans and some other crops as well, but what I wanted to do today is focus in on soybeans. I know you did a lot of work looking at K deficiency in soybeans. How can we diagnose a K deficiency if we get into the season and things just aren't going right?
Yeah, so if we've elected not to fertilize in the fall or not fertilize in the spring, or we're worried, we can always come back with tissue sampling and determine if we have a hidden hunger, where we're at with routine tissue samples. Because one thing we do know from recent work published in the state of Arkansas is we can get a lot of yield back, but once we see a visual symptom, we fell off the yield curve instead of that hidden hunger curve. So I always like proactive tissue sampling when we start getting into those early reproductive stages, so we know where we're at and we don't fall off that yield cliff.
Bobby, you mentioned visual symptoms. let our listeners know what they can be looking for if they see something in the field. How can they think, well, maybe this is a K deficiency?
Yeah, so when we start talking about K deficiency visual identifiers in a soybean crop, it's probably one of the easiest to spot, right? So what we're looking for is a highlighter yellow around the outer leaf margin. Now, when we first see that occur, generally early in the season, it's going to occur on the lower part of the plant, okay, because we know potassium is a mobile nutrient. So we'll be able to translocate that potassium to younger tissue where the plant can try to remain alive and thrive. What I tell a lot of people all the time, the number one goal of an annual plant is to make babies for next year, right? So we want it to make a lot of babies, so we don't want to lose on potassium. Now, what we can see late in the season is if that source sink relationship, once we get into some later reproductive stages, is we'll see that potassium deficiency in the top as well. It'll manifest itself in the top.
So, Bobby, that kind of sounds a little bit like a nitrogen deficiency. And when I'm thinking about that in these soybeans, I'm thinking about these waterlogged conditions that a lot of the beans that you and I are looking at are in these days with all the rainfall. They go into an anaerobic condition and just can't get the oxygen in there to supply that nitrogen. How can somebody determine between those two symptoms?
Yeah, I think when you're starting to look at nitrogen deficiency versus potassium deficiency, I think when we are addressing nitrogen concerns in soybeans, the two that's really hard for me to identify apart is nitrogen and sulfur, because it's going to be a overall lesser green plant. It'll be a overall yellowing of a plant. Maybe what I like to talk about is a washed out green versus this, for lack of better words, highlighter yellow only on the leaf margins that you observe with potassium deficiency.
So, Bobby, if we do detect that we have a K deficiency in these soybeans, and you know where we're at, we're getting soybeans that are getting close to the reproductive stage. If they're not today, they will be in the next week or so. I know other people that are just trying to get those soybeans planted, but a wide range of the crop out there right now. But if we determine in season that we have a K deficiency, what can we do? How do we correct that? Is it worth doing anything?
I think there's multiple ways we can go about correcting it, and there's a lot of research that's been published recently that suggests we can get positive ROI to corrections in season. So we can have multiple avenues. Primarily, if we're seeing a visual deficiency, we're going to need to go out with muriate of potash somewhere in that 60 to 120 pounds of K2O range. I think what's more important is when we catch it, do we catch it early enough, right? So if you think about soybean physiology and where we're at when we start getting into those early reproductive growth stages, and you look at R3 when we start forming those 3/16 inch beans, right? We know we've got that source sink relationship happening. That's generally when we see a lot of this visual potassium deficiency. And based on the recent research, we've got to R4 in some states and R5 in others to get those fertilization out there where we make that yield back up and we're not losing a lot of yield.
So R3 is, as you said, is the critical stage, and that's going to be a 3/16 inch pod on that soybean plant. Is that right?
Upper 4 nodes, if we're talking about group 4 soybeans, predominantly that's grown in the Mid-South.
You said we could get an economic return on this. How much yield can a grower expect to recover if they make these fertilizer applications in season?
Well, I think that really determines on your yield potential of the farm, and every farm is different, right? So I think it's not uncommon to get 10 to 15% back that you would have lost once you see that deficiency. And there's some really great work out there. So not trying to put a number on it, because if you're on a 100 bushel field, that's going to look different than if you're on a 60 bushel field.
Exactly. But we can recover some of this yield that we were going to lose. And you said we can get an economic advantage to doing that. I know you did some work back in Mississippi, and this has probably been 10 or 12 years ago, but you were looking at some small plots and some large plot demos in the same field. And I think we did a video back then that's still posted on our eKonomics website. You were looking at a 12 bushel yield increase in that specific environment. And I think you showed an $83 return on investment after you made that application. So definitely something that somebody can make up some loss there.
Yeah, and I think that when you talk about those numbers, I think that 12 bushels is real. I think the closer we get to R5, it starts backing down, right? So that's a sliding scale. There's some good work put out in the University of Arkansas that's actually got a cost and ROI calculator on it that can show you that. But really, if you look at going into the season we're at right now and the price of potash fertilizer, it's almost a no-brainer to be doing these tissue samples and look at where you're at so you don't have a hidden hunger scenario, knowing, especially in the Mid-South, the severe weather that we've had these beans grow up in, right? Probably going to have a limited root system because, as you said the other day in a field I walked in Friday afternoon, had roots coming out at the soil surface because it's just so waterlogged.
Bobby, I'll remind our listeners they can always go back to our eKonomics website if they're interested in tissue sampling. We've got a video on there that you and I did years ago talking about tissue sampling and how to sample plants at various growth stages. So I want to check that video out as well and learn how to take these tissue samples. That sample's only as good as the quality that you put into it. So make sure you get a good sample if you're going to be doing some of these tissue samples.
That's correct, Mike. And there's a lot of university recommendations out there as well on how to take proper tissue samples. And one thing that if you specifically look in the Mid-South, most of our tissue concentration correlations to yield have been conducted with just taking the trifoliolate and not that long petiole that attaches to it.
Great advice there, Bobby. We've talked a lot about soybeans and the need for potassium in soybeans. What about other crops? We see this K deficiency showing up or the decline in soil test inventories. I know I've been seeing this same thing in cotton for years. Can we recover any yield in cotton if we start seeing that in season?
Yeah, we've got some research, I guess, going all the way back to prior to me joining Mississippi State University when I was at the LSU Ag Center, showing that we could recover cotton yields as well. If you think about cotton, right, it's a tree, it's not an annual crop. So it's going to be, or it will react differently to in-season potassium application than an annual crop. And we all know how cotton throws fruit. So a potassium deficiency can make it throw off fruit as well, just like a cloud or insects. So maintaining that status when we get those real heavy boll loads, we've seen that we can increase yield as well there.
Potassium, we've talked about this numerous times, is definitely one of our essential plant nutrients. I hope we've shed a little light on how important it is today. Bobby, is there anything else that you think we need to cover today? Any take-home messages you want to leave the listeners with?
Most of the talk that we've done today has been in mid-southern irrigated systems. There's just as much work in the Midwest out there on non-irrigated systems showing in-season potassium applications can help, whether it be granular or foliar applied. One thing that we've always said is if you're seeing visual symptoms and it's not environmentally induced via drought, granular potash is probably going to be your best bet. Because the way potassium moves in the soil with diffusion and soil water. Now, if you're in a drought situation and we can't move that potassium to the root, then supplemental applications with nutrients absorbed through the leaves, such as foliars, could help you get through a window in time to make that granular application. And what we've seen, or what you hear a lot of people talk about is, if I'm putting muriate granules out on the ground in season, is the plant going to take it up? Well, obviously we've been talking about how the plant takes it up, but if you look at those recovery efficiencies, they're very similar to pre-plant applied recovery efficiencies and can be as great as 80% based on small plot research.
And Bobby, while you were talking about that, I just happened to think of one other question, and maybe should have had this earlier up in the episode, but we'll go ahead and get it in now. And we talked about how to address this problem if we see a deficiency. Is it better to address this in season, or should we? Are we losing yield still? Are we able to recover all of it? What I'm getting at is, are we better off to make an application in the fall or the spring and address those low K levels then, or can we make up everything that we could potentially lose?
From my standpoint, what I've always talked about, being a soil fertility practitioner and allowing growers to spread their risk around, I always like a multi-tiered approach. We've got a lot of people that want to apply their potassium in the fall, and if your CEC is in the proper levels, that's great. We've got other people that have lower CECs that have moved to an all at plant to in season type system, and it works on their farms. So what I would suggest is get with your advisors that know your farm, know your soil textures, and they can help develop a program for you based on your acre, right? And I think most farms out there that I deal with, we're on a split application method. We'll put a lot of it out in the fall, and then we're going to save some to come back in the spring just to hedge our bets on environmental conditions.
Bobby, we could keep going on this for hours, but I know you've got a lot of stuff going on. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be on the program with us today. Listeners, we appreciate you tuning in, and if you will, hang around just a couple of moments and we'll be right back with segment 2. Farming isn't farming without questions, and now there's a place to go for answers. At eKonomics, an entire team of agronomists is waiting and ready to help for free. No question is too big or too small. Visit Nutrien-eKonomics.com and submit your question with the Ask an Agronomist feature. Listeners, welcome back for segment 2. We have Dr. Alan Blaylock, a senior agronomist with Nutrien, back with us today for another Ask the Agronomist question. Alan, we've had you on and we've talked about nitrogen management quite a bit this season, but one thing we haven't talked about is nitrogen management in soybeans. Now, we know soybeans are a legume, and most people aren't putting nitrogen on soybeans, but do we still have the potential to lose nitrogen from the system, even in a soybean system?
Yes, Mike, we do have the potential to lose nitrogen from a soybean system. Remember, the nodules on the soybean are converting nitrogen from the air into plant-available nitrogen. Well, those nodules, those are bacterial colonies. Well, what do bacteria do? Well, like any other living organism, they grow, they die, they decompose, goes back into the soil. So there's a nitrogen contribution into the soil from those systems during the season even. And then obviously when the crop is harvested, we leave all those nodules behind and we drop the residue, the leaves and stems onto the ground. And they decompose. So there's nitrogen in that plant residue. There's nitrogen in the soil from the soybeans. And as that converts to nitrate, it can be lost by leaching or denitrification, as we've talked about. So there have been some studies that show in a corn-soybean rotation that leaching losses during the soybean year may be greater than during the corn year. So we need to recognize that these are dynamic biological systems and that all these plants need nitrogen. They have to get it from somewhere. And yes, the soybean system is very efficient. Most soybean crops in good soil conditions can fix enough nitrogen to grow good yields. But that doesn't eliminate completely the risk of loss from the system.
Alan, is there anything we can do in that situation to prevent some of that loss?
Well, I'm not sure if there's much we can do. Obviously, growing a good, healthy soybean crop, so the soybean is scavenging as much of that nitrogen as possible, so that's good. Lower yielding crops don't use as much, so if they're fixing nitrogen that the crop isn't using, well, that leaves more in the soil. But, it's a biological system. We don't have control over the rhizobia, really, but I would say growing the healthy crop is probably the best thing we can do. Now, another thing that we can do, and this isn't maybe suitable for everyone, but where possible, if we were to grow, say, a cover crop following the soybean harvest to scavenge any residual nitrogen left in the soil over winter and grow that cover crop until we're going to plant corn or wheat or whatever the next year, then we can scavenge a lot of that nitrogen and keep it circulating in the organic fraction in the soil and not leave a lot of nitrogen in the soil to be lost.
Alan, great information. Thanks again for joining us this week. Listeners, we really appreciate you tuning in. And as always, if you have any questions about anything we're talking about, you can visit our website at Nutrien-eKonomics.com. Until next time, this has been Mike Howell with The Dirt. Hey guys, if you like what you heard today, do us a favor and share this podcast with someone else. It could be your neighbor, your friend, your crop advisor, or whoever you think would enjoy it. Your support helps ensure future episodes, so please like, subscribe, share, and rate the show wherever you're listening from.